Hello everyone and welcome to round 4 of the 1972 World Chess Championship match between Boris Spassky and Robert James Fischer. Now, if you've been with us so far, you know that Fischer for the first time won a game against Boris Spassky. It was not on the main stage of the playing hall in Reykjavik, Iceland, but rather it was in the backstage. That room was primarily, designed to be like a relaxing room, like a ping pong room where you would hang out and play some sports, and it was definitely not fit to play a World Chess Championship match in. So Spassky did complain after that while playing the game. He could hear noise from the outside, he could hear children laughing, children playing, he could hear the traffic noise, he could hear dogs barking. And although he didn't file a formal protest, he did say that he will not be playing any more games in the backstage room. Okay, that was to be expected. But Fischer also filed a formal protest saying that he will still not be playing if there are any cameras around him. But luckily, Chief Arbiter Lothar Schmidt noticed that the formal protest delivered by Fischer was not signed by Fischer himself. And this is something that was not according to rules, and he could completely nullify this Fischer's appeal. So Fischer had no choice but to agreed to play on the main stage, but still they only used that one camera that Fischer didn't mind, the closed circuit one, although Fischer still complained that even though he couldn't actually hear it, he said that he could sense it. And it's not completely not understandable. I can imagine some people would have problems concentrating and really putting their self into the game if they knew they were being broadcasted on a large screen in front of a lot of people. If you remember Josh Waitzkin, he had similar problems after they made a movie about his life, Searching for Bobby Fischer. He said that he could no longer focus on the game. He couldn't put his entire thought process into the game because he was constantly thinking about how he appeared to the outside audience. So I don't know. It does kind of make sense. But Fischer didn't really mind the cameras. He didn't mind if the cameras were recording their board, but he had a problem if the camera was recording him. So he asked if the television house could somehow notify him when the camera was recording the board and when the camera was recording him. As they didn't really have a good way of solving this, Chester Fox offered an idea to Lothar Schmidt and said that perhaps we could give a signal to the players, either via a sound signal or maybe just signalize it somehow. But that idea didn't seem very attractive to Fischer or to Spassky, so they just decided not to go with it. But okay, after everything was said and done, no one could really say if Fischer will show up for the fourth game of the match. But as the fourth game started, Fischer had the white pieces, and for the fourth game, Fischer was actually there on time. And as usual, when Fischer has the white pieces, he opens with e4. And in the previous encounters between Fischer and Spassky, Spassky usually replied e5. But here, Spassky prepared something very special, and he played c5, the Sicilian defense, and he decided to challenge Fischer where Fischer is strongest, in his own favorite variation in the Sozin attack against the Sicilian. So I really enjoyed preparing this game for you, and I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I enjoyed preparing it. So let's dive straight into it. Knight to f3, we have d6, d4, c captures, knight captures, and knight to f6. All pretty standard. Knight to c3, knight to c6, and bishop to c4. We have the Sozin attack on the board. e6 and bishop to b3. So again, we transpose into the Scheveningen variation, bishop to e7, and here Fischer did play a game in the 1962 candidates in Curacao against none other than Efim Geller, and here Fischer continued with f4. He lost that game to Efim Geller, and as we've already mentioned, Efim Geller is, along with Nikolai Krogius, Spassky's second for this World Chess Championship match, so Geller of course knows this very well, and by that by that comparison, Spassky knows this as well as his second. So Fischer came prepared. He plays bishop to e3, an improvement on his f4 idea. We have castles, and here again Fischer castles. As if you remember from the while we were covering the 1970 Palma de Mallorca interzonal, here Fischer continued queen to e2 against the Bent Larsen, and you all know that that was one of the games that Fischer did not win in the Palma de Mallorca interzonal. Rather, it was the only game he lost there. But okay, again an improvement by Fischer. Here Fischer castles, we have a6 and only now f4. Here Spassky could simply continue developing, let's say bishop to d7, rook to b8, but he decides to go with a more active idea. Knight captures on d4. Okay, we have bishop captures on d4, and now bishop to b5. Preparing to develop his light square bishop, and also an idea is to play b4 and dislodge Fischer's knight from c3, from where he's defending the e4 pawn. Okay, we have a3, Fischer stops at b4. Bishop to b7, and now comes queen to d3. And here, this is only move 13, but here you will see how well prepared Spassky came to this game. Because in 1959, in the USSR Championship, Efim Geller had this exact position with the black pieces against Nikolaevsky, and here Geller played queen to c7. And later, when he analyzed the game, he said he didn't really like this passive approach with black, so here he and Spassky prepared a very deadly variation with the black pieces. Here they prepared a5, and you can see how much preparation went into it, because then in the pre-engine era they prepared the move that is actually the strongest move recommended by the engine. So what's the idea here? Fischer's plan was to push f5. Here pushing f5 wouldn't really work all that much, because now black can push a4 after he dislodges the bishop, then comes e5, and here black would be black would stand very well here. After bishop moves, you can simply continue developing rook to c8. But there is the other question. After a5, why not simply capture the b5 pawn? Well, if you capture knight captures on b5, then you no longer are defending the e4 square. Black can simply capture it, and you don't want to give up your central pawn for a b pawn. On the other hand, after this a5 move, you could play queen captures, but then you get bishop to a6, and you lose the exchange here. Although this might not actually be so bad for white, because white can go queen g5, and after captures, white does keep a bishop pair, and it's not all that easy to break through here for black. For example, you can't push a4, the bishop and knight are controlling it very nicely. The bishop pair, the knight, the well-placed rook can come into the attack. White is definitely not worse here, but it would take perhaps a Mikhail Tal to go into a variation like this, although even he wouldn't do this against the Boris Spassky. So okay, after a5, Fischer finds a different idea. Since the move he fears the most is actually b4, that would dislodge his defender of the e4 pawn, Fischer simply pushes e5. The e4 pawn is no longer a target, and now he will question Spassky's idea of actually keeping this pawn unguarded. So okay, what happens here? D captures on e5, we have f captures on e5, knight to d7, and now Fischer says simply, okay, knight captures on b5, I'm up a pawn, what's your plan here? Here comes a move that both him and Geller prepared, knight to c5. So here you have the idea behind the pawn sacrifice. Spassky will definitely win the bishop pair. Either Fischer will capture with the bishop and give up the dark square bishop, or he will move the queen as the queen is under attack, and then Spassky will grab the light square bishop. So Fischer decides to give up the dark square bishop. We have bishop captures on c5. Bishop captures on c5, this comes with check, king to h1, and here, even though Spassky had this very well prepared and definitely had this on the board in his home preparations, we have a very interesting moment here where Spassky goes into a very long think. Very hard to imagine, but if you remember when we covered the Tal versus Botvinnik series, Botvinnik also in variations that he had during his home preparation, he also would spend some 10 to 15 minutes, as if he was just, checking it during the actual game itself. But okay, here Spassky can definitely trade queens. If he decides to trade queens, Then after c captures, let's say bishop to a6, attacking the knight, knight c7, attacking rook and bishop, rook moves, knight captures, rook captures, bishop to c4, attacking the rook, rook moves, and now b3. But if you really look at the position, okay, black is better, even though white is up a piece. But Spassky's bishop is very nicely controlling all the breakthroughs squares. He can easily just put his rooks on the B and D file, and there is no real way for white to ever break through. But there really aren't any chances for Spassky to push for the win here either. So instead of this queen captures on d3, which is most likely what he was working out when he was spending such a long time thinking, he decides to go queen to g5. So as Fischer won the previous game, game 3, with the black pieces, here Spassky also wants to go for the win. The threat is queen captures on g2 checkmate, so Fischer has to prevent this. Fischer plays queen to e2, prevents the checkmate, and now comes rook a to d8. We have rook a to d8, a to d1, rook captures on d1, rook captures on d1, and although Fischer was the one spending a lot of time in the opening, Spassky spent maybe some 5 minutes, whereas Fischer spent over half an hour. Here it was actually Spassky who was down on time. But if you look at the position, I'm pretty sure you can agree that the pawn sacrifice is very well justified, as the strong bishop pair is eyeing Fischer's king here. This bishop pair, it's really a monster bishop pair. The queen is very nicely placed on g5, and if Spassky can get this rook into attack, it will be truly an overwhelming attack. So how does Spassky go about this? Well, he pushes h5 first. As he does have the very strong bishop pair eyeing the king, it makes sense to try and push h4 and h3. And okay, Fischer plays knight to d6, a very nice move. You don't really gain anything by capturing it, you really do need your bishop pair here. Bishop to a8, and now comes bishop to c4. Fischer says, you don't really have anything here, I'm just gonna slowly build up my attack. If you try and prevent it, I'll push b3. If you don't, I can even push c3, b3, and b4, or better yet, b3, c3 and b4, somehow try to get my pawns rolling on the queen side. And Spassky pushes h4. Of course, it would be ideal if you can get h3 in, but Fischer will not allow that. h3 by Fischer himself. And now comes the absolute best move by Spassky, bishop to e3. The ideal placement would be bishop to f4, queen to g3, and queen to h2 checkmate. But, of course, Fischer has something to say about this as well. Rook to d3 would not be so great. Yes, you are threatening to capture the bishop, and you are keeping an eye on the g3 square, but bishop to f4 now, and you can't defend your e5 pawn. Spassky will equalize in material, and he will be left with a better position. So instead, after bishop to e3, we have queen to g4 by Fischer. Fischer offers the trade of queens, and here Spassky simply grabs the e5 pawn. Queen captures on e5, Spassky equalizes in material, but not for long, as Fischer grabs the h4 pawn. Also, Spassky, before capturing the e5 pawn, he had to figure out that knight captures on f7 was not really a threat. It seems like a winning idea. For example, rook captures, rook d8 check, king moves, and bishop to d3. You can't move the king because you get rook to h8, so you would have to block with the rook, and then rook captures on a8. And now you will simply capture on f5 and win the game. Problem is, after knight captures on f7, Spassky can simply play king captures on f7, and now there's really no good continuation here for white. You simply gave up a knight for nothing. So, after queen to e5, Fischer plays queen captures on h4, grabbing the pawn again. And here, Spassky plays an absolute brilliant move, g5. With this move g5, Fischer no longer has a control of the d8 square, and Spassky really wants to play rook to d8 to oppose Fischer's rook on d1. Fischer plays queen to g4, as he can't really give up the control of this diagonal and allows Spassky to play queen to g3, and also sets a trap for Spassky. If Spassky now does continue with this rook to d8 move, then Fischer can indeed play knight captures on f7. And after rook captures on d1, queen captures, king captures on f7, now queen to d7 is enough to claim a draw by repetition of moves. For example, king moves, queen d8 check, you can simply queen e7 check, queen e8 check, and simply keep checking, and if black tries anything to get out of the check, he can even lose the game. So after queen to g4, bishop to c5, again a best move by Spassky, attacking Fischer's knight here, and here Fischer plays knight to b5. It's the best idea. Although the knight is currently somewhat out of the game, there really isn't a better move. King to g7. Spassky, low on time, tries to end the game via the maneuver rook to h8 to h4. But Fischer is just in time to prevent this. He goes knight to d4. Now rook to h8 will be met with knight to f3, and from f3 the knight will be covering the h4 square. And here we have a critical moment in the game. Spassky plays rook to h8. In his book, Gligoric mentions that rook to h8 is a very strong move, but rook to d8 is the move that will allow Spassky to win the game. Why rook to d8 is better than rook to h8? It's not all that easy to see, especially under the time pressure. But to understand rook to d8, we're just gonna have to check out what happens after rook to h8. Of course, now rook to h4 is an idea, so Fischer has to play knight to f3, which happens in the game. Now, as Spassky really doesn't want to play rook to h4, first he captures on f3. We have queen captures on f3, and then now comes rook to h4. Sorry, not immediately. Rook to h4 doesn't work because of g4. I mean, it is a better continuation than what Spassky played in the game. In the game, Spassky played bishop to d6, which threatens checkmate, but it allows Fischer this queen to c3 idea, which was played in the game. And with this move, Fischer forces a trade of queens. And now that you see what happened in the game, you will be able to understand better why after knight to d4, a rook to d8 was better than rook to h8. Rook to d8, simply a triple attack against the knight. You do have to prevent this. Only good way to prevent it is c3. And only now, after Fischer plays c3, you play rook to h8. And now, the same variation doesn't work for Fischer, because queen to c3 with a trade of queens will be impossible, because there is a pawn on c3. But it's not all that, black and white. Fischer will still have this try of bishop captures on e6. And now, if you capture, you will get knight captures on e6 with check, king moves, knight captures on c5, and now you are unable to capture the knight, because if you capture, queen e6 leads to checkmate. King moves, queen checks here, king moves, queen checks here, and after king moves, simply rook to d7, and you are getting checkmated. The problem is after this maneuver of bishop captures on e6, f captures on e6. You don't capture immediately, but rather first and in between bishop captures on d4. C captures, and only now queen captures. Queen captures on g5 with check, and now queen has to block. Queen check here, and now if you move along, for example, f8 or along g8, then white can keep checking you on this dark square diagonal. So you have to block with the queen. Queen f6, queen to g3 check. King to h6, and now d5. This is pretty much forced if you want to save the game with white. The idea is rook to d4 to h4 with a win. So black, of course, will not allow this. Queen to g5, and here you have to trade queens. Queen captures, king captures, and now b4. A captures on b4, and here you have a position where Spassky has an extra piece, but Fischer has three pawns for the piece. The coordination between Fischer's rook and all of these pawns isn't all that great, so it would be very hard to save this for white. That's why Gligoric says that in this position, rook to d8 followed by rook to h8 was much better than rook to h8, what was played in the game. But in time pressure, I don't think anyone could find this. But okay. We have knight to f3, captures, as we already said, bishop to d6, threatening checkmate here, but here Gligoric also mentions that rook to h4 might have been a better try. Now, if you just move the bishop as the bishop is under attack, you're going to get rook to f4, so you do have to block it, and only now you play bishop to d6. And now queen to c3 with the trade of queens doesn't work, because you also have to keep an eye on the h3 pawn. So now queen to g2, and now the white queen is stuck guarding the h3 pawn, but also the checkmate on h2, and it would be impossible to play this for white. So again, another lack of lapse of judgment for Spassky, but all in time trouble. Bishop to d6. Now Fischer, as we already mentioned, trades queens here. Queen captures, pawn captures, and now Spassky could capture on a3, but it only simplifies the position. For example, bishop captures, rook to a1, attacking the bishop here, Rook captures, threatening the g5 pawn. You have to protect it, and now whatever you play, black will eventually capture the c3 pawn, and with equal material on the board and the opposite colored bishops, it's a dead draw. So after bishop to c3, Spassky tried a different approach, bishop to e5, but it's pretty much all the same. Rook to d7, the threat is bishop captures on e6, king to f6, we have king to g1, bishop captures on c3, bishop to e2, bishop to e5, king to f1, and now rook to c8. The only way Spassky can get the rook into the game is to move it away from the h-file, but as soon as he does this, Fischer takes advantage of it. Goes bishop to h5, threatens the f7 pawn. You can't allow this to happen, so rook to c7. We have rook captures, bishop captures, and now it's simply opposite colored bishops. It's a dead draw. a4, Fischer simply puts a pawn on a light square as Spassky has a dark square bishop. King to e7, king to e2, f5, we have king to d3, bishop to e5, we have c4, king to d6, bishop to f7, and after bishop to g3, Fischer played c5, offering a trade here. If king captures, then bishop captures here, and it was in this position on move 45 that both Fischer and Spassky agreed to a draw. So a very impressive game, and you can really see how much history and preparation went into Spassky challenging Fischer in his favorite line, in the line that he's strongest, in the line where he defeated a lot of strong grandmasters. So very impressive, and you can really see how useful his second Effingeller is in preparing him for these games. So yeah. Like I said, I really enjoyed preparing this game. I really hope you enjoyed it as well, and I do hope you're enjoying the Fischer series so far. I would like to thank John Welsh, Alejandro Musca, Simon Nordhall, Julian Schoen, and Chase Faley for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. To answer Chase Faley's question, Ivanchuk perhaps is not my favorite chess player, but he is definitely in the top 3. So yeah. Once again, that's the game. I do hope you enjoyed it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, hopefully, with another interesting video. Thank you all, and I'll see you soon.